If I flick through what we'll go over today, a bit of a background to what this tool is all about and the contents of the actual guide. A bit also around some of the practicalities, and this is something I found really interesting being involved in this project, and actually how do we go about ensuring that IAM components get evaluated. In the tool, we also include a few scenarios, so we'll run through those and get your thoughts about particular examples and methodologies for evaluating IAM components, as well as key considerations as well. And I'll be curious to hear from the people on the call what you think of the programs. Oh, can I just check you can hear me? Okay, I've had a message about my connection. Steve, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
I can hear you. Okay. It's a bit choppy.
It's a bit choppy.
Yeah, it went a bit choppy for a second, yeah.
Okay, so I'll crack on. If there is a problem, if I'm not coming through clearly, just drop a note in the chat. Yep, excuse me, and then we'll have a look at some evaluation questions and a chance to do a bit of an activity around that before looking at the checklist, which is included in the tool as well. And from my side, it can be quite an informal piece of time now. If you've got questions or thoughts, just pop your hand up or unmute yourself and shout out, and we can certainly have a bit of discussion around a lot of this as well. That's the overview. I hope it sounds good. And in terms of the background to this piece, so the tool itself is now available on the Learning Corner, and really it came about from a series of conversations between MapAction and CART ONG over the last few months. And it sits under, or in some ways is linked to a program which CART are running around strengthening CSO IAM dimensions of programs and looking to support particularly Francophone NGOs in the different stages of data analysis. And from that came this idea, actually, it might be useful to provide specific guidance looking at the evaluation of IAM aspects of projects and programs. And the need really comes from the fact that evaluating IAM components is perhaps a bit unusual. It's a bit niche, like we see here. It's a small number of people who are directly related and involved with it, but also there are very specific considerations when we're looking at evaluating IAM components, and perhaps slightly different to evaluations of other program areas as well. I think that the IAM and data parts of programs can be a bit blurry, and they might be ill-defined at the start of a project. And I think also evaluators typically wouldn't have that kind of expertise and skill set around information management, around data and digital areas. I also think that, and this is reflected in how we came to develop the tool, not many organizations have done this, and not a huge number of people have specifically looked at evaluating the IAM component of the program. Yeah, it's a bit rare. So to do this, we had to think about what is particular to IAM and evaluating IAM, and also what would be useful in terms of the contents of the tool to help organizations go about this. We did a bit of desk research and also reached out to a few monitoring and evaluation forums. And actually, it showed there really wasn't much existing already, which is probably good because it's probably showing that there is a bit of a gap around this area. So we put together a rough version of the tool, drawing on some existing good practice around evaluation and adapting particularly a existing checklist, because that was something we wanted to include in the tool, but really putting it in that IAM context and relating it to information management and data aspects of projects, and then shared that back at a learning and exchange day with kind of example users to gauge how they found the tool, what they were finding particularly useful in it, and crucially, what could be done to improve it as well. So those updates were incorporated to get to the final tool, which we'll run through today. There we are. And I think also from my side, I found this a really neat project because it has brought up some really important questions, particularly around the practicalities of how we go about evaluating IAM components. And that's built into the tool a wee bit as well. So in terms of the structure of the tool, you can see What's included here on your screen starts with a bit of an introduction as well as some definitions and a range of examples as well to try and make it quite concrete for users. We look at some of those practicalities that I'm talking about, as well as a few bits around starting with the why. What's the purpose of evaluating a particular IAM component? We use some scenarios in the tool to highlight how different methodologies might be applied to different kind of use cases almost, and then look at those particular considerations that are, which are unique to IAM. And there's a bit about evaluation questions, some examples for people to build from, and then this checklist. So this checklist is designed to really take people all the way from just beginning to think about wanting to evaluate an IAM component, all the way through the different steps to completing that exercise and making sure it's useful as well. So making sure that the results have an application and can be picked up. So that's what the structure of the tool looks like. As I say, it starts with a bit of an introduction. I won't read all of this, but I will say, Steve, yeah, go for it.
Not sure if you can see the screen. Siobhan, just at the bottom, you can see the presentation button. It says restore or minimize presentation at the bottom left. So I believe I think that should help.
Yeah, let me try that again. Can you see it now? Oh, cool. Great.
Yeah.
That was easy. There we go. So I've just had a chat through this, which is the table of contents in the tool. This is what the introduction looks like. As I say, I won't go through this point by point, except to say that checklist is drawing on and it's quite a heavily adapted version of a framework from Better Evaluation, which is the Rainbow framework, and is a fairly good, robust outline of how to go about managing an evaluation, not specifically to IAM. So we've incorporated some of the principles of that, but linked it very much to IAM. We also look at a bit of a definition in the tool. And thanks. And there's a definition from the Interagency Task Force and IAM, but also what we're really focusing on here, and I think this is important, is looking at information in terms of program data and data that is used and collected by organizations in the context of their programs, and slightly different from a information management program. It's really that information management and data part of a program, which gets into some specific considerations when we think about the evaluation of it and how it sits within a wider program of work. And drawing on some work from CART, looking at the practices and also the needs of Francophone CSOs, there's this particular data management lifecycle. So in the tool, we also included quite a range of different, different examples of data in IAM that may feature in the program and may be the subject and the focus of the evaluation. And you can see here there's quite a wide range from new data holdings and repositories, new databases. It might be a change in practice around digital data collection, or new ways of sharing information and data, new ways of trying to enable decision-making, or good practice frameworks and ways of working, or it might even be around changing capacity amongst the people involved in data, like new program staff specifically looking at IAM and data roles, or particular training related to the data literacy of staff. So it just gives users a sense of the range of things we're talking about in terms of those IAM components programs, and also the kind of examples that might be something you want to be evaluating and understanding, well, actually, what is the relative impact of this in the wider program? What can we learn from this so it can guide what we do in the future? Okay, cool. So we have I hope, a poll set up, and a quick question for the group. From your sense, like how difficult do you think it would be to get some of these IAM components included in an evaluation or themselves evaluated? Do you think it would be actually really difficult, very, very challenging, a little bit challenging, no problem at all, it's easy, or not sure? So I'll click over and see if I can see the poll has come through. back on in. Okay, and we see, I think you can probably see the results as well. All of us feel it's somewhat challenging. It's not impossible, but it's not easy either. Oh, and some people saying it's harder. That may have been me. And any thoughts about what's behind that? What, you know, why is it that it's not easy? Why is it that this is actually a little bit difficult?
I would say in terms of priorities, like usually there's limited resources to conduct evaluation, and this probably isn't top of most people's list to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that we've also made reference to in the guide, exactly that.
I think also that information management can sometimes be like a piece of a puzzle of, say, a disaster management program or something similar, and therefore is wrapped into the evaluation of that part of the program rather than its own separate thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we come on to have a look at these scenarios, something like that is included, because I think that's the reality, and that's most often where we find these kind of components. Yeah.
Also say that information management tools themselves are not, they're just thought of as functional a lot of the time within humanitarian response. They're not necessarily considered worth evaluating because it's part of the actual, the programmatic activities in and of itself, or the meal activities in and of itself. So the idea of seeing them separately, it doesn't necessarily exist all the time.
Yeah. Cool. So, and maybe a couple of those points are echoed in this. And this part of the guide came from some of the feedback from that exchange day and sharing the draft with people. A couple of people saying, okay, but in terms of the practicalities, how do we go about this? How do we make sure that there is a inclusion of IAM and data components within an evaluation? And I think there are a few things to consider. Starting early is always important, and potentially also making clear, even in the program design, what the result or the outcome of the IAM components may be. And this will help on a couple of levels. It will help around giving some guidance to what the evaluation might be focusing on, but I think also in terms of kind of raising the profile a little bit and saying very clearly within the program, this is what is expected to be achieved. As we were just talking about, Paul, I think you said the piece of the puzzle, absolutely, and where there's the chance to incorporate it into wider program evaluations and wider program activities, it gives a way in almost to evaluating IAM components and making sure they're included. But also, it may be the case that we need to advocate for it, and we need to present the case and explain really clearly why there's an advantage to including IAM components in evaluation, or carving out space for the evaluation of them. And then fundamentally, it involves getting people together. You know, if we're going to start the evaluation process, the first thing we need to do is bring those people who are involved and have a stake in the evaluation, bring them together and get that consensus around why we're doing it, why it's important, and starting with the end in mind, what it's going to be used for and what it will be useful for. So we included a couple of pointers there. Cool. Okay, and I'd like to throw it out to the group again, and we've got a whiteboard which I'll open up in a second. But really, I'm interested in what people think are some of those key enablers and also those key blockers. You may have come across them. You may have a particular example in mind or something you'd expect. What are the key enablers and blockers when trying to evaluate a IAM aspect of a program? So there, I'll just fire up the whiteboard. There we go. If you can see that, there's a tool in the top right, the pencil or the pen, and in there then there's a text option. So if you drop in, I'll put labelers here. is like that. Oh, not like that.
We cannot contribute. I don't know how Steve you can contribute. Oh, it's only me.
There's a. Hang on. Still going to use.
Ah, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I see now.
I don't know how to edit the one I've just written.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, another minute or two. I see people are still writing. I also see a lot more blockers than enablers, which isn't necessarily a surprise, but okay, any last thoughts going in, but a little run through. Okay, cool. Okay, let's have a run through these. It's good. I'll see if I can read these back okay. And a few things coming through as enablers. See if there is potentially dedicated funding for a new system or a new tech. And I guess that relates more to an accountability aspect other than maybe some obligations for wherever that funding is coming from to be assessing the impact of that. Or funding to new, dedicated to new solution, I think is the same. The previous experiences of IM and programs is a good point, and I guess relates to this element around who those key people are, and maybe something that's quite, or can be quite specific within IM components of programs around that makeup of the key people and the key stakeholders. And if people have previous experience, then they're perhaps more warm to the idea of an evaluation and an assessment. And this last point, I think it's a good one around IM being a dedicated row item in a project plan. So maybe also reflected in the program log frame and what the program's seeking to achieve, and perhaps a little bit more highlighted than just as an enabling factor. But I also see some blockers. The funding definitely can be a barrier. Already too many questions in the evaluation, yeah, and I think this is where that need to advocate and lobby for the inclusion of IM aspects in perhaps quite a busy evaluation anyway is necessary, and being very clear about what the benefits are. There may also be something there around the approach and almost the scale and how to go about an assessment of the IM aspect. We can come on to that a bit more. Lack of understanding and perhaps interest in how IM impacts the program, I think, could be related to that advocacy part, but I think it's also perhaps around being able to, and it links to another point I saw, how to measure the impact of IM below it. Yeah, actually ways of going about teasing out the relative contribution that IM has made, and you can always have a counterfactual analysis framework, yeah, and what the aim is and being clear about that. Oh, that's great. Thank you. And I think it'd be good to kind of bear these in mind as we go through looking at the next parts of the guide, because I think some of them are kind of touched on, and would be curious to hear how well it addresses these questions about actually measuring the impact of IM as well. Oh, I need to switch slide one sec. Cool. Okay. And so the next part of the slide delves into the purpose and the why, and I think relates to that point around needing to have the aim of the evaluation very, very, very clear. So we speak a little bit in the guide about clarifying the purpose, and it's very broadly, as most evaluations, that could be around learning, whether it's learning within the program to improve the delivery of the rest of the program, maybe a midterm review or mini evaluations and assessments as you go along, or if it's about generating insights and evidence at the end of a program to inform work going forward and to learn from what has been delivered, or whether that purpose is more about the accountability. And we're also talking about how sometimes it can be a bit of an enabling factor where you have an obligation to be delivering an evaluation to fulfill certain donor requirements, but it also gives us a way into ensuring that that evaluation and generating evidence does happen. The guide goes into this in a little bit more detail. I won't run through all of this, but it's just to give you a sense that it helps people to think through those broad areas in a little bit more detail. It's not enough to say, well, the purpose is for learning. It's really about focusing that in and being very, very clear about the aims of that and what we're seeking to achieve. And on this is also included some examples of how those findings might be applied and what they might be used for. So, excuse me, the next part of the guide really delves into a few different scenarios and potential evaluation approaches. I'd be curious to hear back as we run through these. Those who are interested in, well, hang on, how do we measure the impact of IM components and programs, whether some of these methodologies give us a bit of a way in. So there are a couple of different scenarios, and again, kind of linking back and drawing on those examples earlier on, but each one has a slightly different approach, which is appropriate for the particular example. For the first one, it gives a scenario where actually the expected outcomes of, in this case, a new information management system have been quite well defined. We're fairly clear on what it's meant to achieve and how it's meant to help wider program oversight. So in this case, the approach would be almost a fairly classical evaluation, looking at the extent to which those intended results have been achieved and anything we can learn about that process. It's kind of contrasted with the next scenario, which is underneath it, where in this case, all right, we have a new database and it's pulling in risk and hazard data and data about particular populations and geospatial data, but really not a clear idea at the start of the program what that was going to do, what result that would achieve. And in this case, a very, very different approach to an evaluation of that would be the right way to go. And it'd be exploratory, it'd be looking at gathering the kind of outcomes that have materialized through the program, using something like outcome harvesting, for example. The next scenario we included was around more looking at the quality of data collection and what kind of difference in quality and how that transition when going to digital data collections has worked. So it's a case where you could probably link up or draw quite heavily on the digital principles framework for the evaluation. The barrier around limited evaluation resources mentioned earlier, and certainly a scenario, say the second one along on the middle, it might be that actually we have very, very limited resource for an IM component. It might sit within a wider program, but that doesn't mean that we can't use internal evaluation approaches and maybe peer-led evaluations to help us to understand, hang on, how effective has this been and what can we learn from it? So the scale of the evaluation can be related to the scale of the resources available. On the top right is a scenario where actually we're interested in how new approaches to sharing program data across organizations and new ways of working has actually enabled change in that wider program. And the approach here would be much more drawing on theory-based evaluations, so something like contribution analysis or outcome mapping. But also, if we're interested in trying to determine impact within that quite hazy and slightly complex situation within a broader program, detailing out what we expect to happen, this is how contribution analysis typically works, drawing out what we're expecting to happen and that theory of change sitting beside it might be a good way to go, and then being able to see, well, is there evidence for change having happened in this way? And what kind of confidence can we have that the IM component of the program has been enabling that to happen? The final example is more, I guess, focused on continual adaptation, improvement and learning. And here the example is that we have a new set of tools for data analysis, which is meant to be helping decision makers and new ways of sharing program results. But we want to be able to check this is working and adapt it as we go along. So it'd be more around mini evaluations, maybe it's a larger scale midterm, but those formative evaluations as you go through. So just a bit of a range of different methodologies and some example scenarios that they would relate to. What I would be interested at this point, though, is hearing kind of how these resonate with you, and maybe if there's a particular scenario which resonates most, which one would that be? Maybe pop your answers. Yeah, pop your answers in the chat. Is it a scenario where actually you have those program results of the IM part quite clearly defined, or is it a scenario where actually what you're really interested in is that learning and continuous adaptation? Which scenario resonates with you most? So if you want to write a note in the chat, but don't send it yet, I'll give you a minute to write it in. And then when you're ready, we'll press send and see what comes through. 3, 2, 1. And if you send it now. I'm saying number 1 is the only one you've seen in an evaluation. Okay, yeah. And we're actually seeing people certainly having come across, yeah, number 1, where we do have quite well-defined results of an IM piece. That's interesting. And I think I'm casting my mind back to when we ran through these with the people at the Exchange Day. And if I remember correctly, and Steve, I can't remember if you were there or not, I think people were saying that more often it was that those results are actually quite ill-defined and quite hazy. So slightly different this time around. Ah, cool. And in that case, actually, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, that was me. I was just going to say I wasn't there, but I did hear that as well. And I don't know, those are also like program practitioners more than IM people. So it could be a component of speaking to the crowd, I think. But which kind of also potentially sees the gap between the program teams and the actual IM or M&E teams, and what they see as like more relevant of IM evaluation potentially.
Yeah,
just an idea.
It could be. And then I guess when we think about, okay, well, how are we understanding impact? We can certainly understand the effectiveness of a particular IM component if those expected results are well defined already. Then we have a way of assessing how or to what extent those results have been achieved and what's behind that. And it gives us at least some way into understanding the impact of it, particularly where that impact sits and if those results are kind of placed in the context of the wider program. But as we were just talking about, might not always be the case. So before we have a look at some of the considerations that we pulled out through the guide, again, I'd just like to throw it out to the group. From your side, I mean, what do you think is some important or a particularly important consideration if we were looking at evaluating data and IM pieces of a program? And also, so what? Like, what's the implication for this, for the evaluation? And happy to hear people's thoughts. If you want to unmute yourself or pop a note in the chat, whatever works. So for me, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I guess the same as any other evaluand, like identifying what the users would want to get out of doing the exercise, and how the information would be used.
Yeah, absolutely, and very utilitarian focused. The checklist that we'll look at in a moment certainly includes a point or two very much in line with that, thinking, okay, who are the key people that need to know about this and what will they use it for? Yeah.
I would say the fact of key consideration could be the fact that it wouldn't be required from the donor, because realistically, the donor itself would be looking for an evaluation of the program activities, and the IM component would be part of the NGO being able to actually conduct the program activities. Which, yeah, and if there's not that type of upwards pressure, then it would have to be kind of internal requirements that would make an organization want to evaluate the IM component. So it's a much larger question that's not very practical, but definitely a key consideration, which I suppose would then be that there's not necessarily an internal buy-in or pressure for internal buy-in.
No, absolutely. And I think actually it has some quite practical ramifications though, doesn't it? And this is where, as we were talking about earlier, there's the need to get the buy-in from the right people, maybe advocate for it, maybe sell the benefits of going through an assessment or evaluation exercise, and if it does relate to funding or program quality and kind of influencing in that way. Yeah.
I think kind of also from my side, it's around kind of a demonstration of like change. So for us in a recent kind of program, we essentially kind of ran a simulation to essentially look at if the IM work that's been done in the past year has actually been successful and resonated, but then also being able to see, so some of the IM components we were doing it were for disaster management programs, of which some wouldn't manifest itself until there was an emergency. So yeah, it was kind of, can these be applied in peacetime, and yeah, just kind of seeing evidence of that, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. And actually, that's a great methodology which I hadn't thought about or included as we were putting this tool together, and it's a really good one, and particularly in that kind of DM context where until there is actually an event, you're never going to fully know kind of how well it works or what the impact is. Yeah, and maybe one to kind of bear in mind as we go through the checklist as well, and could have a think about that. Yeah. Cool. So I think last couple of bits before we take 5 and have a little break. The couple of, and this was, as I was saying earlier, this is for me something that was really interesting, trying to pin down what is it that's specific to evaluating IM and data aspects of programs different to other program areas that you evaluate or more general evaluation principles. And there are certainly a few. I think chatting to colleagues in MapAction, very often we'll go through that process of doing some scoping, some IM or data scoping, and CART have developed a fairly extensive self-assessment tool. So if there is something like that exists, then it gives us a potential for some baseline information or something that can be referenced through an evaluation. We were talking, and I heard somebody say something very similar to this. The second point here may not be a priority area. You know, it might not be something that a lot of people are particularly interested in. So that early planning and some advocacy to include the IM component within wider evaluation activities might be the way to go, and also being realistic about what resources could be available. In cases also, there's the digital principles framework, and that might help provide some of the basis for a methodology if we're interested in assessing a particular IM component in that kind of way. And Steve, I think you were alluding to this point that actually IM components may be seen as tools to enable the wider program in itself. So the question is, okay, how do you include in a program evaluation the relative difference that IM component has made? And also the specific results associated with IM could be very, very different from other program areas. There are a couple more. I think this next point was also raised, that the people who are actually invested in the IM dimension might be quite different to other program areas and other program people. And we were talking a bit already, we've kind of covered this, that those results and those outcomes, they may not be well defined. Today on the call, we think actually they can be well defined, which is great. And also whether or not they sit within other program documentation, whether there are indicators and metrics associated with them, or where there are cases that they aren't, how do we then go about perhaps building that logic model of, well, what is the IM component going to do, and including that as part of the evaluation methodology. And there may be might be quite different elements around the technical component and looking at the tools themselves and the specifications versus that difference that the data and IM piece has made to the wider program. Yeah, and whether it's an enabling factor, what is the right way to go about understanding how that is impacting on program results. So there are some of the considerations that we've included in the tool. And I think, yeah, I'm going to suggest at this point, we're about halfway through the session. Should we take a break for 5 minutes, have the chance to stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee or whatever? It's also a geeky little fact of the day. We all have a diurnal lull at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's a good chance, good chance to take a quick break. And should we say we come back at 10 to? Would that be good? Is that long enough? Coffee time. Let's say 5 to. We've got plenty of time. Okay, see you all in just under 10 minutes. Thanks. To be the minutiae and the detail that you'd ask in a survey or through a key informant interview, but more those broader questions to guide the evaluation. And we included some looking at the kind of results and the outcomes, some more towards that process level, and then a few examples at the quality level as well. And in a very broad sense, what is actually different as a result of the IM element of the program? Or it might be more around how the change in the quality of the information management processes has contributed to the results that we see. So quite a range there. What I'm more interested in is from your point of view, and maybe if you think about a particular example, what key evaluation questions would you like to ask? And Paul, you raised the example earlier of taking a simulation exercise. Did you have particular, I wonder if I've got a slide. Yeah. Did you have particular guiding questions for that?
Hey, so I mean, the simulation was part of a much bigger simulation on kind of disaster management in general, saying like if an emergency was to happen, and then where would you do mobile data collection, and basically kind of using that as a prompt for, okay, like, can we see if they can effectively create XLS forms and do reporting and create maps based off of, say, emergency needs assessments, for example, and then present that back. So yeah, I mean, the evaluation at the end was quite, I would say, it wasn't that rigorous. It was, can you do it? Is the output, does the output satisfy the decision maker's need? Yes or no, rather than anything concrete. Yeah, I mean, that was an example, but
yeah. And I guess there's something important there related to the scale and how robust or not a particular assessment or evaluation may be, and whether that's appropriate as well. You know, there might be cases where you don't need to spend a huge amount of time and effort and resources to actually answer that kind of key question that you're suggesting. Are the outputs what those decision makers and key people need? Yes or no? And how do you go about understanding that? Yeah. Cool. So I will briefly run through what the checklist looks like, which is in the tool, but then I'll give us a bit of time as well to go to a small group and maybe just work through an example and have a think about how the checklist might be useful in that. And as I was saying earlier, the checklist is split into 6 different parts. The first one is a bit like we've been talking about at the beginning of the session, some of the practicalities around how to actually make a start. So can you include the evaluation in the wider design of the program? Do you need to lobby for including the evaluation? Do you need to influence a bit? Making sure that you have specified who those key people are, identifying the stakeholders, and then getting people together to agree the evaluation and begin to actually document what you want to do with the evaluation and how to plan it out. The second step is around that setup and the planning. So understanding who's going to be involved in managing the evaluation, who will provide advice, who will make recommendations. I think this is the point raised earlier about who those key people are. See who's going to conduct the evaluation, if it's something that an external evaluator might do or fits into a wider evaluation, or actually if it's something that you'll do internally. And kind of related to that, look at what resources there are, and also what standards you want the evaluation to adhere to. And there might be internal ethical standards. The quality might well be determined in terms of reference and what the expected deliverables are. Then there are a few steps to take people through really defining the evaluation and getting it all ready to go. So as we were talking about the why of the evaluation and the purpose, making that very clear, looking at what the key evaluation questions that the evaluation is going to address is, and then developing the scope of it, the initial description, and those more formal documents. So making sure that there's the right terms of reference, and excuse me, if the evaluation of the IAM component is within a wider program evaluation, how to include key areas within that terms of reference in terms of the wider terms of reference. And actually, the point Ron made earlier around actually this is quite busy, so this could be quite difficult, right? In reality, there might be a question of trying to influence and trying to be very, very clear about why it's worth including a particular look at an IAM component. When you also mentioned, okay, starting with who are the people that are going to use this, and being clear about who will use the results. And depending on what you're trying to address through the key questions, it might be that you want to go through that process of developing a theory of change or a logic model to really describe how the IAM component is going to be impacting a bit more broadly. Next step is about determining, okay, what's the approach we're going to take, and then actually going through the process of collecting our data. So selecting our sample, whether there are existing metrics or measures to draw on or to reference, and how our data collection is going to work, and data management. And then in some ways, the kind of fun part, the sense making and producing those insights. So going through your data analysis stage, seeing if the results stack up to what you'd expect if the IAM component was having that contribution to the results seen, being able to reference your key evaluation questions and provide some results against that, pulling the information together, and crucially, the so what of this, where you have those results and maybe some draft recommendations, collaboratively looking at, well, actually, what does this mean? What does it mean in terms of future work? What does it mean in terms of how we mitigate risk in the future? What does it mean in terms of decisions that we can take forward? And the final area is really making sure that whatever comes out of this process is useful and is used. So making sure that if there are any reporting requirements, this feeds into that. Developing the actual materials to share, if it's a written report or verbal briefings or whatever it might be. And then also going through that process, supporting those primary users to apply and make use of the evaluation findings. The other thing we included in this step, because it might be a bit unusual to be specifically evaluating or including an evaluation of the IAM components, is perhaps, it's a little bit better, but perhaps reviewing the evaluation process itself and taking time to do a bit of a retro on that. So that's the overview of the actual checklist and how it's designed to really help people identify all the steps that they might want to take when evaluating a particular IAM dimension of a program. What we would like to do now is just give you guys a few minutes to think through, I put a slide together. Think through how you might actually find use from this checklist. So in a breakout group, we'd like you to take a few minutes just to come up with a particular example. It might be a historic example. It might be something you're currently involved with, which you would like to evaluate. And once you have the example, if you want to just get a single sentence about what the background of perhaps a wider program is, one sentence, okay, what does that IAM component look like? Whether there is an evaluation or there's not, kind of yes or no, but then really having a look at the checklist and thinking, okay, what difference would this make to being able to assess that IAM component? There is another whiteboard which I can load up if you want to make notes on that, or feel free to just jot down some notes through the discussion, and then we can come back and share back. So I think we have kind of 15-20 minutes for this exercise. What I will do, in a sec, I'll just put a link to, there we go, a link to the guide in the chat. So you can open this, it's that one there. If you open that up, that checklist is sitting towards the end of the guide. And Sylvia, I don't know, do we want to fire up a breakout room or let
do we stay? Yeah, we can also stay all together, no? As we have only a few participants.
Yeah.
So would you like to put again the whiteboard?
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And then to clean the comment, I did take a screenshot.
Oh, grand.
It's white. Okay.
Cool. So
we are just losing your instruction.
Oh, no problems. I can. So the instruction is, I'll pass it over to you guys. If you want to shout out a few different examples of IM and data aspects of programs that you might want to evaluate, or you might be working on at the moment, which would be useful to be thinking about the evaluation of them. Decide on one example, a very quick brief about what the background is in the wider program, what that IM component looks like, and then really having a look at the guide and seeing how this would be useful in guiding that process. So I'll hand it over to you and mute myself, and yeah, feel free to share some examples.
The edit function on the whiteboard isn't working or switched on, I think. Awesome.
Okay, thanks. Is that it now?
Yep, all good.
Cool. So it looks like we've got a couple of different examples. Another one coming through. Move that. And do people want to just quickly shout out anything more about these examples? So can I ask who's pop the first one in around use of MDC tools?
That one was me.
Cool. And is this linked to a particular program or?
So yeah. I kind of put two together, two programs. Apologies for that. So the needs assessment was a program that British Red Cross is supporting with the Nigerian Red Cross in developing their disaster management capacity. And the IAM component was around so the use of Kobo, and then kind of how that is then used in for like any analysis, like data analysis type things. And then the cache is mostly kind of linked to emergency response as well. So like where is it used for registration, distribution, etc. That one kind of hasn't really been evaluated as such because it's linked to cache readiness. But the top one, the needs assessment, was like I mentioned earlier with the kind of use of simulation exercises. Yeah, so that's one I quickly jotted down. Yeah.
And can I ask just on the the cache programming, that's not wrapped up in evaluation at all? I know that there was a kind of growing evidence base for cache programming from the Red Cross.
Oh, sorry, I meant the kind of mobile data collection specifically is mostly built into kind of data management, data readiness kind of elements. So I meant specifically the mobile data collection tools and the evaluation of those, rather than cache the whole thing.
Oh no,
yeah. Yeah, it's mostly tied in with data management. Yeah. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And Siobhan, do you want to run through your example?
Sure. I was thinking about I'm facilitating a workshop in a few weeks about like to design an evaluation. So I was thinking if I was going to include like an IAM component in that, how would I do it? The workshop's a group of partners who've been implementing a program together. So I imagine the focus of their evaluation is going to be about how the partnership actually functioned. And I would think a big part of that was how information was communicated and managed between those partners for, decision making, reporting, all of those things. So I think to be able to do that, first of all, there'd be a bit of advocacy for getting it included, because I doubt that that's on anyone's thoughts, even though personally from my perspective I can see it as something that's like really impacted how they operate.
Is it? Yeah.
But I think when you've got a group of kind of non-experts looking at that, it's not always picked up. So I think that advocacy piece is really important, which might also link to thinking about defining. I liked the point around defining a theory of change, like for the IAM component. I think that's a useful way of framing it to be able to make that case. And then I guess it would be also consistently advocating throughout the whole evaluation process to make sure that's always being included and thought about like possible.
Great, thank you. And it sounds like there's quite a clear application of it as well, right? If you're aware that this is something that has been impactful and excuse me, something that you've certainly seen being quite a useful component of that partnership and of that program, then actually being able to consolidate and codify some of the evidence around that could then be very, very useful going forward.
Yeah, for sure.
Would it? Sorry, I'm making an assumption. Would it? Because how much of it needs to be that kind of more formal evidence base versus just almost institutional knowledge?
I think it would be helpful because I think it's something that the different people working on those teams of the partners haven't thought about how impactful it is. It's a system that's not working well, to clarify. So I think looking at how those problems have impacted the actual program delivery is something that's quite relevant to look at.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And then it would also contribute to that higher level goal of, was the program effective, efficient, whatever. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And do you think the checklist is useful then? Does it prompt some ideas about approaching that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in some senses, it's not any different from any other evaluation checklist, right? If you were to write down all the steps, you'd follow that.
Yeah.
But just putting it from the perspective of information management and being able to think those questions through from that perspective, I think is quite helpful.
And I see there's another example on the whiteboard, the evaluation of the use of IAM products by the target audience, if it's operational NGOs. Steve, did that come from you?
Yeah. I was just trying to think of a personal example, and to be honest with you, in terms of actually evaluating IAM components within projects, I'm not sure there's anything I've formally done, apart from when I was working with an H2H organization, where the project itself was effectively sharing data and promoting the use of data and maps and whatnot. So like our products were the IAM component, right? So the activities were the creation of the IAM products that were then supposed to be used. So then you have to evaluate their use. But this is obviously kind of a step up from the, evaluating this becomes very complicated because you have to go and ask people in a certain way, and how useful are the products, and what should we change, what information are you missing, and having a large sample when you're talking about a relatively small number of NGOs, even if it's within a fairly, this was in Syria, even if it was a fairly, saturated NGO context, as it were. You're not exactly having like a survey use that you can do. So kind of thinking about it through it and taking an evaluation approach like this would have been very useful for us. And and then kind of wrote down the checklist relevance. There are definitely things that I think were not done very well, and that this could have been used for. Yeah, I suppose that's a fairly specific example because it's not IAM used within programs, but it's the use of IAM products by programs teams separately.
Yeah. And it's an example that's very, very cognate with a lot of the work that we've been doing within Map Action, looking at some of our monitoring and evaluation, and very much that. How do we gauge the relative utility, the quality, and the impact of infographics and maps and data, and a lot of it around that follow-up. And to some extent, but also, and I'm interested to see you put defining that theory of change, because we've also taken a bit of a theory of change or a theory-based approach to those evaluations, saying this is what we're expecting to happen, and we're expecting that there's a link between providing these products and then it relating to other people's decision making and helping with that. And that's where we cap it. We don't say the decisions are going to be better or the results on an affected population are going to be better or different, because we can't measure that. But we can say, well, our theory takes us up to here. Can we see any evidence of that or not? And it's worked. We're able to use that approach to get a good sense of the relative impact. Yeah. Cool. There's one more note. I'm just going to check if this is covered. Evaluation of the program simulation exercises. So Paul, this is what you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Yep, that's the same. Yep.
Lovely. So we're obviously coming up to the end of this session. From my side, thanks so much for listening to me chat away, and I hope that it's been useful to get a bit of an insight into what this guide's all about and what it contains. There's obviously lots more detail, and you have the link to be able to have a look at it in a bit more detail if you're interested. Before we wrap up, just want to open it up to any other kind of questions or thoughts or bits of feedback, anything people want to share. When I see your notes in the chat, welcome, cool.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think sorry, I think I cut you off there.
I cut you off as well. I do have a question. What is next kind of with this checklist from either a kind of Map Action or Kotlin side? Like, is it going to be developed further? Are there going to be kind example use cases, things like that. Yeah, I'm just intrigued. Thanks.
No, it's absolutely the right question, Paul. Thank you. And something we've also thought about, I guess, when we were designing and developing this initially, the idea would have been to be able to test it out in a few different examples, get feedback from it being actually applied, and then, as you say, building out those use cases. Because we've had the amount of time we've had to develop it, we haven't got to the point where we've been able to include piloting it. So it's just been made available to people. And if we want to get really better, well, what's the result and the impact of this guide? And I think it's as much something designed to be kind of seeding the idea and promoting the idea for some of the target organizations. We're very open to kind of collecting further feedback on it, but not really expecting to. And as far as we're concerned, it's kind of finished. There's the potential, I think, for further work in the future to collaborate and possibly go through that process of identifying a couple of organizations to kind of support the use of it and pilot in a bit more detail. But at the moment, those plans are not set in stone. There aren't a kind of firm plans to. It's just a recognition that it'd be cool to do. Yeah. Steve, I don't know if you want to say more from Cart's side on that.
I'm not completely clear on that at this stage, but I do know that it looks like this project will be continuing into next year as well. So, I mean, from my personal perspective, I think it would be really cool to see kind of actual use cases and have something that's publishable from them, even if it's just an extract applied to maybe one of our partner organizations. But yeah, that's yet to be confirmed, and that will be early next year that would start this process regardless. But yeah, not completely sure on my end either. But I think the hope is definitely that the conversation at least got started, that it's essential to start, for us to be thinking about the evaluation of IAM components of programs, which is not systematically like we do the program activities themselves, because I don't think that that's necessarily something that I've at least experienced when working in NGOs before.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. And yeah, as I say, great question, Paul. Anything else? Sounds like we're there. So I think we can bring it to close again. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for your time. And yeah, if you do have any particular thoughts or comments, feel free to drop me a line. Be happy to chat further. Cool.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sylvie and Steve, helping to set this up and run it and everything. It's good.
Thanks for preparing everything, Tom.
Cool.
And have a good day.
Lovely. Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Thanks, Augustine.